Dobrý deň, vítajte pri sledovaní podcastu Okno do sveta. Prakticky od začiatku nového milénia sa v Európe pohybujeme akoby od krízy ku kríze. Veď len v ostatných rokoch sme tu mali finančnú krízu v podobe krachu Lehman Brothers, migračnú krízu, pandémiu COVID-19 a s napadnutím Ukrajiny Ruskom aj najväčší konflikt v Európe od druhej svetovej vojny. Rok 1989 nám umožnil slobodne cestovať. Od roku 1993 sa Slovensko zapájalo stále viac do medzinárodnej spolupráce. Stali sme sa členmi OECD, Severoatlantickej aliancie, Európskej únie. Navyše sme otvorená, proexportne orientovaná ekonomika. To všetko sú dôvody, prečo si potrebujeme uvedomovať a vnímať zahraničnú politiku, medzinárodnú situáciu a jej dopady na našu krajinu a naše životy. Ambíciou tohto podcastu je priblížiť aktuálnu zahraničné politické dianie z pohľadu Slovenska a jeho záujmov. Mojím prvým hosťom dnes je veľvyslanec Spojeného kráľovstva Veľkej Británie a Severného Írska na Slovensku, Nigelom Bakerom. Welcome, Nigel.
Thank you very much. It's great to be here.
So, recently there was a reshuffle in UK and you got a new boss, you got a new foreign secretary, which is not altogether that new person in a British politics. David Cameron used to be a prime minister of the UK. What do you think was the reason for this?
No, absolutely. It's a sort of an old new boss. I think as you set out, the world is in a difficult place at the moment. Slovakia has made extraordinary gains over 30 years. We're celebrating 30 years of diplomatic relations just this year, but we're in a world of considerable instability, which requires skillful diplomacy and great experience to navigate through the crises and the difficulties we face. I think Prime Minister Rishi Sunak felt that there could be no better person than David Cameron, now Lord Cameron, somebody who has that experience, who knows everybody there is to know globally, and who I think has maintained his finger on the pulse of international relations. It's interesting that his very first visits as Foreign Secretary were to Kiev and Odessa, and also to the Middle East. As well as a quick trip to Brussels for NATO foreign ministers. So setting up very clearly in those early visits, those early calls, his priorities, the priorities of the Prime Minister. And in a way, it means that the world gets two British Prime Ministers for one with David Cameron. He'll be loyal to Rishi Sunak, but he brings that extra dose of prime ministerial expertise and experience to the role.
Well, I have no doubt he will have a lot on his plate, and this context he has will make a big advantage for him and for the UK. But you already mentioned a couple of visits he made. Let's start with the biggest conflict we have, which is the conflict in our neighborhood. That's Ukraine. And how do you see the situation there? And what is British involvement and what is British interest in this conflict? Because we in former Czechoslovakia, we remember the situation before the 1938, the famous slogan, "The Czechoslovakia is far away," country which we know nothing about. Well, Ukraine is in geographical point of view even more far away than Czechoslovakia used to be, but I was very much happy that Britain was one of the leading countries when it came to the support of Ukraine.
Yes, no, absolutely. I mean, it's worth remembering that Winston Churchill, of course, refused to support the government in 1938 and had a much bigger vision of the world than the then Prime Minister. His bigger vision of the world was that if you appease dictators and if you allow the doctrine that might is right to prevail in the world, you have a world without rules, you have a world without order, and since World War II, you completely undermine the United Nations Charter, which essentially is our blueprint for world order and relationships between sovereign and independent states. And that's exactly why we are so engaged with Ukraine. As you said, we were the first country to provide Ukraine with military support to help to defend itself. And fundamentally, we are a UN Security Council member. We believe in the rules-based international system. Countries like Britain and Slovakia depend on that system for our free trade, for the health of our democracies. And when a country like Russia, even worse, a permanent member of the United Nations Security Council, decides unilaterally that its neighbour has no right to be a sovereign state, that its neighbour has no right to make sovereign decisions, indeed that it itself, Russia, has the right to just, whenever it wishes, take over the land of another country. That is a world in which we cannot allow to prevail. So for us, it's very, very clear matters of principle, but also, I think, a recognition that for the United Kingdom, Euro-Atlantic security is an absolute priority for us, and Ukraine is part of that pattern of Euro-Atlantic security. Russia is not only invading Ukraine with this aggressive and barbaric war, but also immediately threatening all the countries, all of Ukraine's neighbours, including, of course, Slovakia, the peace in Europe, and the system that we have in Europe. We can't allow a single country just to go back to those pre-1945 days when might could prevail, and appeasement of dictators and authoritarian regimes allowed them to prevail. So it's both principle, but also very practical interest for the United Kingdom as well.
Yeah, I think you are right. The behavior of Russia very much remind us of the world before the Second World War. That the might is right, and we should go after our interests, whatever it takes. And even though I think that this interest was ill-defined from Russian president, but I think we can sum it up that British help, assistance to Ukraine is very much in the Churchillian tradition, and also it is an attempt to keep the world order, to keep the rule of law.
Very much so. I think that dictators and authoritarian regimes often make the bet that democracies are weak and they won't stand up to threats. Democracies sometimes take a while to mobilize themselves. And of course, we have our, if you can call it weaknesses, it appears from the outside sometimes weakness. We have free debate. Different opinions are allowed. People can disagree with the government. And democracies don't go to war quickly. And they sometimes, and we need to engage and persuade public opinion, something that President Putin doesn't even try to do in Russia. He dictates public opinion. So all of those things are are important. But I think that we've been very clear, and I think not just the United Kingdom. I mean, it's been extraordinary. I think the unity of the democratic world, democratic Europe. I think Putin was certain that European Union wouldn't be able to stay together, that NATO wouldn't have a united position. And what has happened, actually, it has meant that two neutral countries in Europe, Sweden and Finland, have decided that the threat is too great. They should join NATO for their safety and security. The European Union and the G7 have passed, with the United Kingdom, many packages already of sanctions against Russia, and the support has been constant for Ukraine, both military support, diplomatic support, economic support, and of course humanitarian support. And I think it's been great to see Slovakia playing a really important role in that.
Yeah, and I wish we will continue because it's so important for our own security, and for us, as you mentioned, it's really important that the rule of law will be respected, because for middle-sized countries and smaller countries, this is absolutely essential. And what I said in the intro, we are very much open pro-export economy. So for us, the rule of law is absolute fundamental, even for our own prosperity. But when we speak about Russia and we speak about the aggression towards Ukraine, we somehow should not forget to mention that that Russia behaved aggressively towards West even before that in a different manner. What we could call the hybrid war or hybrid threats, and which are focused on undermining our democracies, our systems. And I know that UK was a target in several cases when one thinks about the former Russian spies who find their asylum in UK and who were an object of attacks. How do you see this hybrid war, and are we too weak to defend ourselves? Did we miss something in the last 15 years? Did we start late? Where is the problem?
I think that, I mean, you're absolutely right. There is a war being fought against Ukraine on the battlefield, but there is also a war being fought against Western democracies through different means. You mentioned the attacks, attempted murders successful murders in some cases of Russian dissidents in the United Kingdom. Yeah, a blatant attack, not only a targeted attack, but effectively using chemical weapons, illegal chemical weapons in 2018 against Sergei Skripal, for example. So that is one element of hybrid war. Another element of hybrid war we have seen recently, and we continue to see, is the sort of weaponizing of migration. We're seeing right now Russia pushing migrants from the Middle East through Russia at Finland, for example, as a threat to the Finnish border, and the Finns have had to close their border against Russia. We saw that with Belarus and Poland. And of course we see the hybrid war being fought through virtual means, through disinformation campaigns using particularly social media, so-called alternative media platforms. And it's something that we identified really from about the time, and started identified as a serious threat from about the time of the Russian invasion of Crimea. Of course it had existed before. Government propaganda, one can go back to Adolf Hitler using the radio against Czechoslovakia, for example. Yep. So this is not new, but what is new is using social media platforms and the extraordinary sort of flood of disinformation, counter-truth narratives that we find across social media in particular. In a way, it's Russia thinking we've identified a weakness of the West. It's called free speech.
Yeah.
We don't understand its strengths because we, the authoritarian leaders of Russia, don't believe in free speech. But it means that we can actually speak out or get proxies to speak out on our behalf in Western countries, and that'll undermine those countries. It'll confuse them. We will deny things. We will send confusing messages. We will try and make truth a relative thing, making it very difficult for governments to respond. And it's critical, as in any war, be it on the battlefield, be it where you have to close borders against migrants, or indeed in the virtual space, that we as democracies are clever enough, I think President Chaputova has said, not to be naive in responding to that, in building our defences and in building our counter defences against such efforts. They're difficult to identify sometimes, and they are difficult to defend against because we believe in free speech. Yeah. But in the United Kingdom, we've worked very hard at this through strategic communications, through counter-disinformation work, through helping to get clear messages out to the public, and generally, I feel that we've countered it quite well. But it's a constant battle. It's a constant threat, and Slovakia, I know, is a particular target for Russia, and we've seen that in recent years.
I'm afraid you are right when it comes to Slovakia. What I envy UK is the system of strategic communication you created for years, and I'm really glad that you were able to share it with us and work on a project of strategic communication, because it's an important part of the resilience of the country. And how is it with the UK projects in Slovakia? Will they continue, or is it in discussion with the new government? Where we are?
So, I mean, we signed a strategic, a joint declaration launching a strategic dialogue with Slovakia earlier this year. When I had the chance to meet Foreign Minister Blana recently, we talked about that, and part of the sort of package of bilateral engagement was continues to be sort of engagement on strategic communications. And I made the point that, you know, this is unfortunately something that every democracy faces. It's a threat that every democracy faces. So we have to communicate with each other. We have to share best practice and strengthen ourselves, because when you're talking about democracies, you know, the weakest link is the weak for everybody. You know? Because we must be strong. We must be strong together. So I hope it will continue. Of course, we work with government. We also work with institutions outside of government, because this is targeted not just at government and government institutions, but it's targeted against broader public opinion. So we work with websites, with institutions that influence public opinion, and with government. And I hope very much that that this sort of work together will continue. We can learn a lot from Slovakia, and I think Slovakia can learn something from our experience of dealing with these threats over some years.
So we can say that strategic communication and building up resilience could be a Slovak contribution to the security of the whole alliance in this aspect. Yeah, it's interesting that how Russians approach us. That I would use the IT metaphor, that they didn't go after hardware because their economy is not strong enough, but what they choose is to go after the software and implement in people's heads some ideas and alternative views, which create that our defense is weaker. Some countries are stronger in resilience, some are weaker, but we should work on it together. When we speak about the security situation in the world, obviously the focus has changed after the Hamas attacks on Israel, on the horrible terrorist attacks on Israel on 7th of October. And it changed the focus of the world. Now, in the newspapers, in the Western capitals, there are not so many articles about Ukraine, and much more articles about Middle East, because even though it's much smaller country, the potential to explode in the Middle East is very high, and also with this, the rise of anti-Semitism in the world went up. How do you see the situation in the Middle East, and how we can help Israel to defend itself, but also to take care of a complicated situation there vis-à-vis the Palestinians living in Gaza?
Yeah, I mean, it's a huge priority for us. I should say that Ukraine remains the major strategic priority, I would say, for the United Kingdom. But having said that, as we know in foreign policy, you know, the issues you have to deal with don't come consecutively one after the other. They come all together. Yeah. And you have to be able to have that flexibility and agility to respond to multiple threats. And the situation in Palestine itself, and the problems and the difficulties, and in a sense the poison that it injects into broader Middle East politics is not brand new, of course. What is new, though, of course, is the extraordinary the viciousness and scale of those terrorist attacks on 7th of October by Hamas, which inevitably have forced Israel to respond. Why? Because Israel has a right to live in peace as any other country. The scale of those attacks, some people have called it sort of Israel's 9/11. Now sometimes the analogies, you have to be careful with those analogies. But in the end, Israel cannot now feel secure while Hamas is able to operate freely in Gaza as a neighbor. So we absolutely support Israel's right to defend itself, and the appalling tales we've heard of the murders and rapes of Israeli civilians and other international who happen to be in the neighborhood, I think is really reinforces that. At the same time, we have said to Israel and continue to say to Israel, as far as is possible, you must respond proportionately within the limits of humanitarian law. That's very hard in the sort of situation they're in, but we have emphasized that also because we must all keep a focus, and it's in Israel's interest to keep a focus on the day after. What do I mean the day after? Yeah. I mean the longer term solution to the problem. Israel's security and stability, in the end, depends on the security and stability of Palestinians. We have long advocated for the two-state solution, a valid Palestinian state alongside the state of Israel. And that is something we continue to do. So alongside the supporting Israel to defend itself and of course providing as much humanitarian support we can to the innocent victims of all this. In the end, Palestinian civilians are the victims of Hamas terrorism as well. That's a consequence. But we must also look to the longer term, both so that it cannot be repeated again, which means the removal of Hamas essentially from the picture, but also a way in which Israel can find peace and stability with its neighbors across the broader Middle East and with the Palestinians specifically, which is why David Cameron has been in the Middle East. He's been talking to Middle Eastern leaders, both in London and in the region. Rishi Sunak was doing so just the other day when he was at COP28, focusing on climate change, but very much focused on the issue in the Middle East. It's not easy. It really isn't easy, but we agree with the United States, who are critical players in this, that we must continue to work towards that two-state solution. We talked to Prime Minister Netanyahu about this. We talked to President Abbas of the Palestinian Authority, who will have to play a role after the fighting has died down, and hopefully when Hamas is taken out of the equation, and the broader area. We don't want the conflict to spread across the region. I think the regional leaders do not want that either, but they all recognize that in order for that to happen, work on a longer term solution that benefits everybody, Israelis, Palestinians and the wider region, has to be ongoing, and we have to work even harder to find that solution, because not finding that solution for that two-state balance for 40 odd years has been part of the problem in the region, and has been one of the reasons that Hamas has been able to build up its strength and its sort of poisonous ideology in recent years.
Nigel, this is your second term as a diplomat in Slovakia. You have a Slovak wife, so you know us very well. We as a country are not that experienced in international relations as UK, who was involved in the Middle East for years or even centuries. How would you explain to Slovaks why should we care about Middle East? Because sometimes this is the most difficult task for me as a Slovak diplomat to explain to our public that we should care, because somehow it will come to us sooner or later our interest within the country, but also around the world, we will feel it. So how would you explain to Slovak that you should care about Middle East, you should care about the situation in Israel?
I think I'd say that there were two sort of baskets, two areas that Slovaks should care about. One is principles and values, and the other is very practical issues that affect Slovakia. First, principle and values. And we said at the beginning, Slovakia is a democracy. Slovak people have fought for democracy in 1989, after many years of authoritarian rule. Slovakia has been prosperous and successful, as you said in the introduction, through its open trade, through Slovaks being able to travel, study freely, to be able to vote here at home, to be able to do business with other countries, to take its own decision to join the European Union, to join NATO. This is all underpinned by the values of democracy, enshrined in the United Nations Charter and in the world since the end of the Second World War, and especially since 1989 and the end of the Cold War. These values have to be applied as far as we can universally, because it is in our interest for the world to operate in this way. And therefore, when we see a fellow democracy being attacked by terrorists, a terrorist ideology that Hamas are very clear, they are not democratic. They want to eliminate a whole nation. Yeah. They want to. They have no interest in democratic rights, the rights of ordinary people, day to day living. We have to tackle that wherever we are in the world, and it's in our common interest to do so as a democracy. So that is the values that we have to stand for, and we have to stand up for them wherever they're under threat in the world. That's something I think the United Kingdom believes in very firmly. And I think Slovakia, as part of the community of democracies, as member of NATO, member of EU, member of the United Nations, it's right that Slovakia does so as well. But then there's also a very practical set of issues. We face across Europe a migration crisis. Yeah. Where are the migrants coming from? The migrants are coming from parts of the world that are facing conflict, from Afghanistan, from Syria, from parts of the Middle East, from parts of Africa where you've got threats of climate change, you have sometimes civil war, displacement of people. As an aside, Russia, of course, is very active in many of these areas of conflict, fomenting the conflict in these places because it puts pressure on the democratic world. And so, of course, we can all set up our defences and protection against migration at our borders, but actually, of course, it's far more effective to ensure that countries, for example, countries in the Middle East, for example, countries like Libya, for example, or Afghanistan, are able to manage their own situations locally, that the economy can prosper, that they have the freedoms that we enjoy too, which will allow people to prosper at home and not have to leave and visit and to come to countries like ours. So I think that is important. That is important too, and that's, I think, a very practical example of the ways in which a faraway conflict can have a direct impact across Slovakia. Plus, is what I go back to about this: the benefits that Slovakia receives from open borders, from open economies, from a recognition that we have rules in this world and that might cannot prevail, terrorism cannot prevail, authoritarianism cannot prevail. A world where might is right puts a country like Slovakia under great threat, under grave threat, constant threat. It would be an expensive world. We'd all be spending 5 times more than we currently spend on defences, on our security services. Yes. So working for peace, being part of that international community, working for peace, is in Slovakia's direct interest, militarily, economically, and in terms of preserving the way of life that Slovaks, after 34 years or so since 1989, have come to appreciate and enjoy.
Thank you for helping me with this explanation, because it is important that people will understand why do we need a foreign policy, why do we need engagement in international relations, why actually we are sending an humanitarian aid or development aid to countries to stabilize their situation, so there would be no pressure for migrants to come to Europe. I spoke about the rise of anti-Semitism, and we saw some massive demonstrations in the UK. They call themselves pro-Palestinian, but also I must say I was very much worried by seeing the flags of ISIS and the very aggressive rhetoric of people in these demonstrations. Do we have it under control in Western Europe, the rise of anti-Semitism? How do you tackle it in the UK? When I lived there as a Slovak ambassador, I was based in Hampstead, so very much close to Golders Green, the quarter where a lot of Jews in London lives, and I feel that in this community there is a sense of high worry that the rise of anti-Semitism brought, and some sources says that it went up very high.
I mean, I think we have seen increase in acts of anti-Semitism and anti-Semitic attacks in the UK. The government's very clear that any sort of racism, discrimination, anti-Semitism is entirely unacceptable. And we have also seen, it's important to say, major demonstrations, public demonstrations also against anti-Semitism, supporting the Jewish community. In fact, there was one just the other weekend in London, a huge demonstration, not just of members of the Jewish community, but also many other ordinary citizens. I mean, there are great passions stirred by this debate on university campuses, in homes, in the media, and we see that. And we believe in free speech. We can sometimes be difficult sometimes. Free speech sometimes means that people very passionately say things that we completely don't agree with. We have the option to respond to that. But free speech, it's not absolute. There is a line, and the line comes when that free speech turns into aggression, turns into hate speech, turns into threats, and of course tips into incitement to violence. That is a line that the forces of law and order, our police have to manage, and it's quite difficult when you have very large demonstrations. But they are identifying people who are responsible for crossing that line in, for example, these big demonstrations. Overt support for Hamas is not legal in the United Kingdom because they are a prescribed terrorist group. Overt hate speech is not legal in the United Kingdom, and an individual, if they are foreign, they can lose their passport and be deported, and there have been cases of that recently. Oh, yeah. And if they are British or resident, then they will be prosecuted for that. And the police have been prosecuting and following through on many cases, either brought to their attention or through their monitoring of these demonstrations. But you're right. There is nervousness, particularly amongst the Jewish population, which is not large. The government is supporting protection of synagogues, and I should say mosques, because there's also been an increase in anti-Muslim hatred and attacks as well in parts of the UK. But providing a security support, just saying, is not enough. You have to tackle the hate speech early, to prosecute it when you see it, and also something we've been doing a lot in British schools for many years now is running programs of sort of civic studies, essentially, civic work, where children learn how to debate, how to be critical, how to engage safely in this world of free speech, but in a way that understands where the lines and limits are. So it's a whole of society approach. The immediate threat to any community has to be dealt with through security and law and order, of course. But it's something that the government takes extraordinarily seriously, and there is a very clear sort of zero tolerance position on aggressive anti-Semitic behaviour, hate speech and actions.
Yeah, because what we see from here in Western Europe, there are even demonstrations. It was one in Germany, one in France, where they called for caliphate and basically the change of a constitutional order in Europe, and people in Slovakia are naturally worried about this, because we saw also during the ISIS period that a lot of the recruits for this terrorists and militants came from Western Europe. So I think it's a high time that we put our house into order, and as you said, those people will be prosecuted, and some of them will be deported. I think it's really important for a state to show that the rules apply to everything.
And if I might just say, I think it's really important to say that, of course, the vast majority of people in the United Kingdom are law-abiding, including the vast majority of members of the Muslim community, who are horrified, absolutely horrified, by what Hamas has done, by what people say in their name, and we see this amongst Palestinians. Actually, we see this amongst Arab Israelis as well. You know, they know that those who suffer most from what Hamas is doing are the Palestinians themselves, are other Muslims. The reputation amongst in Western Europe amongst majority communities of Muslim communities is in some way distorted by what radical Islamist terrorists, for example, commit and say. And there are extremists out there, and they have to be dealt with. But I think there is also strong support from within the Muslim community in the United Kingdom for the forces of law and order to deal with those extremists in their midst.
Yeah, I think we have to make clear that Hamas, they are no freedom fighters, because if they would be, they would allow freedom for Palestinians living in Gaza, and it's a solid dictatorship there. One must say. Let's move to the question of how UK operates in the world. You've been a member of EU for decades, and then you decided to leave us. There was a famous Brexit referendum. We miss you around the European table, but how do you feel? Is there any way of recovery from it, or what is the UK stance towards Europe? Because even though you are in the Atlantic Ocean, you are very much part of Europe, and you will always be. But how do we mend our relations between EU and UK, and how we can rearrange that so it will be good for both of us?
I like to think it's not a question of mending relations, it's a question of improving relations and making them even better. Of course, it was a democratic decision by the British public, and as a diplomat and civil servant, you know, I accept that democratic decision to leave the European Union. I think inevitably the first couple of years of the negotiations were a little bit scratchy. I think that was sort of entirely normal, and I think perhaps there were quite a lot of people, including in Brussels, who didn't really want to accept that this was a new reality. But I think we've moved forward quite well now. COVID period complicated, in a sense, some of that work, but particularly with earlier this year, the United Kingdom and the European Commission signed an agreement called the Windsor Framework, which provided for the most complex issue, which was how to ensure sort of freedom of movement and of goods, and the rules related to Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland, that sort of common border between the British Free Trade Area and the European Free Trade Area. With that framework agreement, I think we've seen a real step forward in the doors reopening wide on both sides. United Kingdom has rejoined the Horizon and Copernicus programs, important scientific programs, and we're now associated with that. I mean, 50% of our business and trade is with the European Union, and we are already back to pre-Brexit levels of business and trade. The war, the Russian invasion of Ukraine, and United Kingdom's involvement not only in supporting Ukraine, but also in engaging with all of our allies and partners across Europe in response to that threat to Europe and the Euro-Atlantic security, I think has shown that we haven't gone away. We left the European Union. We certainly haven't left Europe. We remain a European power, absolutely engaged with our European partners. So I think, be it looking at trade and business, and frankly, trade and business between the UK and Slovakia wasn't dramatically affected. I think that kept going fairly smoothly. But trade and business, through diplomacy, through economic relations, scientific relations, the sort of new structures we've had to put in place, because having left the club, as it were, are being put into place, beginning to work quite well. There are still some things we can, I think, do better. I know it's an inconvenience for people who are used to going to UK from, say, Slovakia, working without needing a work visa, for example, and now they do. But there's still huge communities of European Union nationals in the United Kingdom. Over 6 million European Union nationals make the United Kingdom their home, including 140,000 or so Slovaks.
Yes.
They're a great benefit to us, and they're part of that sort of living bridge between our countries. So I think it was a shock, Brexit, to many British people, as well as to our friends and partners in Europe. But I think 7 years on, 7.5 years on or so since the referendum, I think we're rebuilding a strong relationship, and I think looking very positively forwards rather than obsessing about what happened in 2016.
Yeah, I think we should look forward. Even though you mentioned universities, so I know how this changed the rankings of European universities, losing Oxford University and Cambridge University, so we went down, and I think it's really important for the future to have a high level education and research and development, and in this area the cooperation is absolutely important, and I think even for this country the education is a must, and we have a lot to do on that field. You mentioned the Slovak community in the UK. When I was there as ambassador, our estimate was it's up to 200,000 people. It was back then in 2011, 2015 when I was ambassador to UK, which means that like the Košice would move, the entire city of Košice would move to the UK. I remember with a shock when I read a newspaper, I think it was The Times in 2012, when I read that the Polish community in UK overpassed the Indian community, so there was more than 1 million of Poles. It is a good base for cooperation between our countries. So how it is? How are the Slovak UK bilateral relations? And was there a positive impact of a Brexit in the fact that the embassies were strengthened? So we lost one multilateral framework, but we kept it on a level which is acceptable and useful for us. How is the economic cooperation between our countries?
Yeah, I said 140,000 because after Brexit, one thing that was new is everybody had to register. Yeah. And so I know that in my hometown, for example, 72 Slovaks were registered 2 years ago. So, but I think it's interesting. It is this, apart from the Slovak community in the Czech Republic, which of course is very large, it's your largest community anywhere in the world actually, is in the United Kingdom. And I think that, what are the Slovaks doing? They're studying at universities, they are running businesses, they are opening startups, they are running business between the UK and Slovakia, they are married to British nationals, they're active in all walks of life. Actually, I think it's a community that contributes hugely to that economic relationship as well, because many will be if they're setting up a business in UK and then looking to export, where's the first place they're going to be looking to export to? Probably to Slovakia. There are people who have brilliant ideas, maybe here, maybe in UK, great startups. Where do they get finance? UK is a natural place to go for finance for interesting high-tech startup ideas, for example. British investors here in Slovakia, I think, are very happy with what they're doing in Slovakia. When I talk to them, they're almost all expanding their operations here in Slovakia. Perhaps there's a benefit to Slovakia because now British businesses operating in Europe sometimes need a base in the European Union as well as in the UK.
I see.
Where would they go? Well, I encourage them to come to Slovakia because I think I see British businesses like Jaguar Land Rover, like Tesco, like Haleon, like Brother in Krupina, like Tate & Lyle, all expanding, doing great business here. So I think that's going pretty well, actually. I think the relationship at a political level, we left the EU and we're not in those meetings in Brussels within the EU anymore. But of course, we're still a member of NATO and we're sitting alongside Slovakia at the table at NATO. We're in the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, based here just next door in Vienna. We are very active members of the United Nations Security Council, always with European colleagues on that council engaging. We have been systematically signing bilateral strategic dialogue agreements with all of our European partners, including Slovakia, which, as I mentioned earlier, we signed earlier this year, talking about what brings us together in issues like climate change, issues like tackling the Russian threat, issues like dealing with organized crime, which is a feature of any country, countries that have communities in each other's territory. Scientific relations, university relations. Certainly my embassy has expanded since we left the European Union. We have, I have a defense team, I have a national crime agency, sort of police team, I have a very active business and trade team. We have experts on issues like climate change, on political issues that are important to Slovakia, like the Balkans, for example, like the regional work. We have very good relationship at Revenue and Customs, talking to Slovak Financial Administration. So there's a huge amount that binds us together. If anything, we've got busier since we left the European Union. Our bilateral relationship, if anything, has got busier. We don't meet every day in Brussels, so we have to meet in other places. And it means the embassy has to be active. And I'm sure it's similar for the Slovak embassy in London. I'm sure they're extremely active. You have a big consular workload in
yes, we do.
In London, and I know you have a very energetic embassy. The current government is looking to expand its economic diplomacy footprint. I think that'd be great, and we're looking forward to seeing Slovak economic diplomats in the UK. It's one of the places where they absolutely should be, looking at opportunities for Slovakia in Britain as well. So I think there's a lot to do, and there's going to be a lot to do between our two countries looking forward, I think.
Yeah, we invest into that relations. Most recently, we were, after years, able to reconstruct the chancery of our embassy at Kensington Palace Gardens. I'm looking forward to visit it, and I'm looking forward to our bilateral relations and our cooperation on a multilateral level. And I'm glad that you've been my first host and you helped to cover the hottest international issues, but also to explain what is the impact of a foreign policy for a living of ordinary Slovaks and for our businesses. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Foreign policy affects us all.
Absolutely.
Great pleasure.
Thank you.